Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. As is one of the great joys I get to have, my friend Steve Ray is back in the studio with us. And we get to talk about a day in the life of the Holy Family. Steve is a pilgrimage leader, Footprints of God Pilgrimages. He also is an apologist and an author and defender of the Catholic faith. Steve, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, Marcus. Always fun to be here with you guys.
Well, it's always a joy for me because you're a man who loves the scriptures and you love the biblical history behind the scriptures. And that's really important for us to understand the context of the scriptures.
Well, you can't understand the scriptures without understanding the context. If you talk to somebody who's never seen a car and you explain that you get in the car and you shut the door and you turn it on and you drive the car, people have no idea what you're talking about. You just talk nonsense to them. And if you don't understand the context and the history and the meaning of words and so on, scripture would be nonsense. So this is what I love to do. I love to think about it, discuss the words, go back and understand the archaeology, what people live like, and this is exciting. That's one of the reasons I like going to the Holy Land. As you know, we just got back and we're heading back again in the end of February with Ave Maria University, and it's already sold out. So
that's wonderful.
And another one going in April, but we do have a few seats left, but we're going to stick with one bus, so it's going to sell fast.
Yeah. So if anyone's interested, go to avemariaradio.net. Steve's trips are in the travel section, and do sign up because there's no Holy Land trip like a Steve Ray Holy Land trip. So I want to begin, Steve, with this question of the Holy Family. It would appear that the scriptures don't really tell us a lot about the life of the Holy Family. So how do we know about how they lived?
Well, when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote, they were writing to people who knew because they lived in that culture. They understood what it was like to live. And people in Nazareth lived in caves. And you have to explain that to people today. Because there's a great word I love, anachronism or presentism, where we think about the way we live and we extrapolate it or interpret what they did based on how we live. So Mary and Joseph and Jesus got up in the morning and the alarm clock went off and they had the coffee pot ready and all this. But this is, you have to understand what their life was like, and it's totally different. So when we're in Nazareth, I print out 2 pages for everybody on the bus, and they're pictures of what it was like living there back 2,000 years ago. So even I have pictures of girls at the well in Nazareth. The well was a 15-minute walk away from the town, and the girls went to get the water. The men didn't do that. This was a girl's job. And I have pictures of girls carrying jugs on their head 150 years ago in Nazareth, going to the same well Mary did. And I give these people pictures of what it was like Joseph the carpenter and the animals in the city of Jerusalem. There's no cars. There's animals and camels going in and out. Imagine what it smelled like in Jerusalem. But I always tell people, you at home, you always are talking about the divinity of Christ, because you get the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses and all these people coming to your door. So you defend the divinity of Christ. But here, we all agree on the divinity of Christ in this bus. But I want to introduce you to the real Mary and Joseph, the humanity, what it was like for them to live. And, for example, in the cave in Nazareth, the Franciscans are certain enough that this was the house of the Holy Family, that there's a medallion under the altar, and it says, he submitted to them here. Hic is the Latin word. He submitted to them here. So what I do there is I just walk through the daily life of the Holy Family, what it was like for them to get up in the morning, to work all day, what Mary did, what would she have done all day, what did the guys do all day, and what was it like to come back home. And 30 silent years that you know very little about. But we can learn a lot about it by how did they live? Where did they live? What did the women do? What did the men do? And you can get a pretty good idea of what it was like. I always, the first thing I ask the question is, what do you think the Holy Family did first thing in the morning when they woke up? And everybody says, pray. And I said, is that the first thing you do in the morning when you wake up? And everybody kind of looks, has a funny smile and says, no, we go to the bathroom. So I said, okay, now you're living in a cave. Where do you go to the bathroom? And everybody then, well, I guess you got to go outside. So it just, I want to bring the reality of the fact that they lived differently than we did. They had to adjust to life very uniquely different than what we do. And so that's what it's important, I think, for us to understand who they were and how they lived.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And one other thing that I've heard you talk about in terms of the Holy Land too is you've talked about it being the fifth gospel.
Yeah.
Because by itself, it testifies to the mystery of salvation history.
Yeah, I thought I was the one that coined that phrase. I was disappointed to find out that Paul VI had done it before me, and maybe somebody before him too. But yes, we call it the fifth gospel, and that's become quite a popular way of describing it now, because you read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you're reading it in black and white, and you're not living there. You're not smelling what the land smells like and seeing the people. There's a lot of similarities even today when you're there, especially if you go out into the desert with the Bedouins and the sheep and the goats. And so it's when you go and you experience the land, and this is what people tell me more than anything else after leading 100 groups through the Holy Land, the number one comment, and I got it again a week ago after we got back, was the Gospels come alive. I don't read the Bible the same anymore. The Gospels just come alive to me. And I know people say when I'm at Mass and we're reading the Gospel, I want to hit the person next to me with my elbow and say, I was there. So that's, I think, is being the fifth Gospel. It's where then when you go back and you read the Gospels, you can smell what it was like. You can hear the birds singing in the air. You can understand why Jesus talks about the rocks of the field and why he uses the examples he does, because this land is full of, in the summer, the grass dries and withers, and that's what he said, it dries and withers, but the Word of God will never dry up and wither. It'll always be alive. So it's the fifth gospel because it really does help you to understand and get a sense of the life and the meaning, because they thought differently than we did. They lived differently than we did.
One important point that draws up is knowing this helps us know the human Joseph, Mary, and Jesus.
Yep.
And it helps us love them better.
Yeah.
But it also, you and I have talked about this before, it also shows us how modern imagery...
I understand modern imagery of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. Art is not meant to only describe what the eye sees. Art has a deeper... It can do that, but art has a deeper purpose, is to actually elicit the inner meaning or qualities out of something. So you paint a flower, you're trying to make the flower even more beautiful than it is with the eye, because you're trying to get the smell and the whole feel of it. Well, when you do the Holy Family, Mary is the Immaculate Conception. She's the all sinless one. She's the Queen of Heaven. So when you do art on Mary, people often show her as perfection, never a wrinkle in her clothes, wearing blue, which she would not have done, because they didn't have the blue color back then. See, that in itself, they didn't have blue color. They did, but only kings could afford the blue and purple and crimson colors to dye. And you see, I remember one time I found an artwork of Mary, and I said, find the 7 inaccuracies here. And Mary was wearing purple or blue. But the reality is that I think artwork does us a disservice in a way when it shows us the Holy Family in certain ways. And even Jesus on a cross, for example, that he has his loins covered, which is proper. I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but that wasn't historical reality. They were crucified naked on the cross. And it almost looks like he's swooning in many crucifixes. And you don't see the absolute, utter devastation of his body. The Spanish and the Mexicans, they do a better job, I think, than we do of showing that. But even there, you have to see Mel Gibson's movie to get a good idea of what it was really like. So I think the artwork that we see today does us a bit of a disservice, because it's presenting an image of something that wasn't really like that then, although it is showing... It's trying to show Joseph as being righteous, and Mary, she's often got blonde hair, like she's right from Sweden, because somehow blonde hair is better, you're more moral or something if you have blonde hair. I don't know what that is. And Jesus, little Jesus with blonde hair, and Joseph being very effeminate, like he's always carrying a little flower in his hand, and these are, I think, very poor representations of the real Holy Family.
I'm talking with Steve Ray, apologist extraordinaire, continuing on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Steve Ray, and Steve is always so generous. He comes in at least once a month, and he shares with us the devotion of the month. And in this case, we're looking at the Holy Family in an extensive detail. Now, Steve, at the end of the last segment, you just begun touching on just bad artwork, and you just started touching on effeminate Saint Joseph, which you and I both get really irked about.
I do, and I have a friend who has a devotion to Saint Joseph, and I showed him my favorite picture of Saint Joseph, and he was scandalized by it. And he said, "That's terrible. He has this image of Joseph, very effeminate and very white, and like his hands are soft, and he's carrying a lily flower. I know why he carries a lily. It's the story of how he was chosen, and lilies represent, purity and so on. But when we're in Nazareth, I want people to understand what they really were like, not to take them off their pedestal, but they did not walk 3 feet off the ground. They walked in the manure like everybody else did. When Mary went to the well to get the water, she walked with the rest of the girls in the mud. And I always tell people that when she was going to get the mud, I've been in Nazareth where it rained 5 inches in a day, and she was going on her way to the well to get the water with the other girls. And when you are with donkeys and camels, and they leave little surprises behind. I was raised on a farm. I know what it's like and what it smells like. And you don't ever get that imagery. But when Mary and Joseph were on their pilgrimage from Nazareth to go to Jerusalem, that would be a 5-day walk. And they were with animals. And you can only imagine what they were walking in, what it smelled like, flies buzzing around your head. And people say, you can't talk about Mary like that. And I say, yes, I can, because I know what it's like to live there where she lived. The food that they ate is different than what we eat, the life they lived, what they did on Saturday to go to the Sabbath. They didn't go to a big Catholic church like we do. They had the synagogues, and sometimes they were just small synagogues. So this is what I think is, for example, Nazareth. It was about 2 acres in size. And archaeologists have discovered about 25 caves where people lived. And the one where the Holy Family lived, there was reasons why they picked that one and said, this is the one that the Holy Family is. I won't go into all the detail now, but they lived in caves, and caves don't have plumbing. Caves don't have electricity. It's very, very rustic. I don't think it detracts from our view of the Holy Family. I think it makes me more endeared to them in knowing how they lived those 30 silent years in a cave with flies buzzing around, with no plumbing, no coffee machines. It's a very rustic life, and it only makes me appreciate them more.
One of the things you highlight is that this was common. You carved out your home in a cave, and so, like you said, the first thing you do in the morning, like all of those things, they're very natural human realities. And it's not bad to acknowledge that. If anything, it does us a service of thinking rightly about what Jesus lived through.
Yep. Well, and Joseph, okay, he lives in a tent, he gets older. Guys get older, they get up a lot of times in the middle of the night. And you're still young enough to not know about this, but it happens as you get older. So if it's one thing to just walk over into the porcelain toilet in the bathroom, but if you have to go out somewhere every night in the middle of the night, it's a whole different story. So these people were tough. These were rugged people. They didn't have any of the conveniences that we have. I remember one of the times I just realized I was with these guys is when I was out fishing all night with the Sea of Galilee, and I was with Jewish fishermen. They're talking in Hebrew while they're fishing, and they were eating, and they're pulling twigs off the bush off the Jordan River, and they're picking their teeth with it. I was thinking, this is Jesus, and I'm out here with Peter, Andrew, James, and John, just getting a real feel for what their life was like. So I'm doing a show on Sacred Heart Radio on next week, actually. It's called Strange Foods of the Bible, Strange Food and Drink. And just what did they eat? See, they had a very restricted diet. First of all, the kosher rules of the Jews limited what they could eat. The only thing you can eat coming out of the sea would be had to have scales or fins. You were limited into the animals that you could eat, what kind of hooves they had, and if they chewed the cud or didn't chew the cud, and it was very restricted. But they would, one of the things that sparrows, this is just daily life. I mean, this isn't trying to be weird or anything. It's just, Jesus said, you buy 2 sparrows for a penny. So I asked, why would anybody want to buy 2 sparrows for a penny? That's like a fraction of a day's wage. And I realized that the sparrow is called the poultry of the poor. And kids would make money by setting up snares. So I went on YouTube and I saw there's 100 different ways to set up snares to catch little birds. And so the kids would catch these little birds. Jesus probably had snares to catch little birds. What kind of games did he play? And he's running through the streets with his other friends, in Nazareth. But they would catch these sparrows and they would use them as meat. Even many parts of the world they do today. And it's still, for the Jews, part of their kosher rules that you can eat sparrows, which is something the poor people could afford, which they were poor. They were not a wealthy family. Grasshoppers also. John the Baptist ate grasshoppers. We think, well, that's kind of strange. Well, but in the book of Leviticus 11:22, it says that you can eat grasshoppers, crickets, and locusts, things that hop on their back legs, which are a high source of protein. So nobody thinks of the Holy Family eating sparrows or eating grasshoppers, but this is the kind of thing. John the Baptist ate them. They bought sparrows, and what would they do with them? They ate the sparrows because that was food for the poor. We know they're poor because they didn't have money to buy a lamb when they went to the presentation. They had to buy 2 doves, which would be about an hour's labor to buy a dove, 2 doves. And this is the way the Holy Family lived. So you can think, what a waste of time living 30 years like this in this, basic silence and away from the modern world. Even just go to Jerusalem for a week once every year. And what a waste of time, But Paul VI, when he was there, he said that this is the school of Nazareth. It's not a waste of time. And to study their life and how they lived, how they related to each other, what they did during the day, is the school of Nazareth. And we learn from it the importance of silence, of not always being in the middle of everything, but being silent, the importance of family life, and the importance of dignity of hard work, which is what they did, hard work. So
that's a great segue, because the hard work, tell us about that. Joseph, he didn't just work with wood. In fact, he was a skilled tradesman. But where did they work as well?
The general idea that I've come to, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, is that they worked with stone. And the reason for that is we live in Michigan. There's trees everywhere. There's oak trees, maple trees, all hickory trees, and all this wood is lovely for building houses, and pine trees for building a frame of a house. But in those days, they don't have a lot of wood in Nazareth. And even today, the homes are built out of stone. Jerusalem has, by law, you have to have the house built of Jerusalem limestone. So when you look out over the city, it has a uniform look to it. When we drive around Nazareth, in fact, I just took pictures of it 2 weeks ago from the bus window, there's big quarries even now where they're quarrying the Jerusalem limestone. They're cutting it off in slabs. They got hydraulic equipment, and they pull it out, and they use that to build everything with. And the buildings in Nazareth are made of stone, not of wood. So I'm convinced that Jesus and Joseph got up in the morning and they were either quarrying this rock or they were somewhere shaping it. They get to, there's a village called Sepphoris, which is about an hour's walk from Nazareth. And during the time of Jesus' boyhood, the Romans were building a huge city there called Sepphoris. And they were drawing from skilled and unskilled labor from all over to come and do that work. Well, Nazareth is only an hour walk away. These guys are carpenters. Greek word, tekton. It doesn't mean what we think of as a carpenter. Tekton means someone who works with hard materials. It's like a day laborer. The way you could define it is look at Joseph and Jesus' hands. They would be calloused. They would have scars on them from the chisel missing and hitting their hand. I one time took a big rock home from Caesarea Philippi, and I wanted to break it when I got home so I could give people pieces of this rock from Caesarea Philippi where Jesus said, "You are rock." And I hit it, wham, in my workshop, and that just shattered, and I had 8 places bleeding on my hands in a matter of a second because it just, those shards of rock. If I'm working with rocks all day and you don't have face masks and goggles and hearing protection, there's no OSHA requirements there, and they're out there working all day, their hands would be rough and tough and callous. They'd be full. They have to walk an hour to work and an hour back every day, humping rocks around. And this is what I think they did. We'll talk about it. We're out of time.
We're continuing with Steve Ray, apologist extraordinaire and pilgrimage leader, about the life of the Holy Family. On the other side of the break, stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, coming to you from the Good News Cruise 2026. Joy of mine to be joined by my friend Steve Ray to talk about the life of the Holy Family. Steve, you were talking with us earlier about how seriously the work of a tecton had to be done, the amount of labor that entailed. But at the same time, you've got that very hard-working capacity. Joseph was also a very deeply devout religious man. What did that look like?
Yes, and the way that we know that is not only because God chose him to be the father of Jesus. And by the way, it is correct to call him the father of Jesus, as long as we know that he's not the biological father, because even Mary says, "Why have you done this to your father and I?" So Mary she doesn't say your foster father and I. He adopted him. He became the father of Jesus. So he's called righteous. When he found out that Mary was pregnant, he was going to set her aside. And this was in contrast to having the Old Testament law, was that you stoned a woman who got pregnant out of wedlock. Well, that's a whole nother story about what marriage is. We can do that some other time. But Joseph was said, because he was a righteous man, he was going to follow the law in this way. It doesn't mean righteous that he's a good guy. Righteous there means in relation to the law. It's very specific, meaning relation to the law of Moses, he was particular. He was careful to follow every statute and every rule. He didn't deviate or try to find ways around the law. He obeyed the law out of the goodness of his heart. He was righteous regarding the law. Therefore, you know that he would have lived his life very strictly as a Jew. I have a picture of Jesus with a prayer shawl on, and this is what the Jews did. They were very religious. They had certain garb. They had to wear their hair in a certain way in order to be a peculiar people, to stand out from the Gentile nations. And Joseph and Mary and Jesus would have followed these rules to the T without being like the Pharisees who were coming up with all these extra. They were careful to obey the law of God within the proper boundaries. They would have followed the kosher rules. They would have eaten what they were supposed to. We know even from Peter, when he was going to go to Cornelius, who was the first Gentile to come into the church, and he's thinking he's unclean. I can't go there. He's a Gentile. That's unclean for us Jews to go into their house even. And there's all these animals came down in a sheet in a vision, and they had all these animals that Jews were not allowed to eat. And God says, kill and eat. And Peter says, I have never eaten anything like this in my life. I follow the kosher laws of Israel and of the Old Testament. And God says, what I have cleansed, don't call unclean. In other words, Peter was very careful what he ate. He could even say, I've never eaten anything that was forbidden by the law. Jesus and Mary and Joseph would have been the same. Joseph was a righteous man. He would have been very meticulous in following the law and raising Jesus to do the same. So they would have taught Jesus how to pray. Can you imagine teaching the Word of God, how to read the Word of God? Interesting. How do you teach God to pray to God? Interesting. In his humanity, they had to teach him these things. And we get up in the morning, we get our prayer books out, we get our, I think their minds are much better than ours, and I'll tell you why. See, we get our Magnificat and our daily devotionals out. I know my wife every day gets on her iPhone, and she has a whole series of prayers that she goes to websites, and I think it's lovely. But they didn't have any of that, and they didn't own books. You know, you see pictures of Mary and her mother with a prayer book in the morning. They didn't have books back then. Paper wasn't invented until a couple hundred years ago. You had to have animal skins. It took 900 deer or sheep to make one Bible back in those days. That's why the print, when you see the old manuscripts, the print is so small, and they didn't even make space between words because that vellum was so expensive. You had to write on it. You had to keep it so small just to not go into more and more vellum. Well, anyway, they didn't have money. Their books were not owned by people, so they had to memorize these things. So when they would travel from Nazareth to Jerusalem, there were 15 psalms called the Psalms of Ascent. Psalm 115 through 1 115 through
130,
130, and they memorize these. One of them is 122. That I rejoiced when they said unto me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord," and they would memorize these things. This is why they did antiphonal singing like we do at Mass. It wasn't just to sound pretty, but they did it as ways to memorize. And even some of the Psalms, you don't see it in English, but they are acrostics. They have the Hebrew letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and they would help them memorize Scripture, all of these different helps that they had. So they didn't have books to read like we did. They had to, it's in their head. They memorized it. They sang it. They chanted, really. So they would go to Sabbath, Saturday. There's no working. They'd go to the Sabbath, and people get also mixed up that there was a temple in Nazareth. No, there weren't. There's only one temple. The temple was in Jerusalem. They had synagogues, places of learning, but the temple was in Jerusalem, and you had to go to the temple to make your sacrifices. But they would gather together in the synagogues where they would pray together and teach and talk. And so that would have been a very important part of their life, is that Saturday where they would have time together as a family. It was a father's job to teach his son. Today we leave it up to the schools or up to the priest or up to catechetical classes. No, back in those days it was the father's job to teach his son. Fathers today need to step up to the plate. Even if your son goes to school, your daughter, you're still responsible for what they're learning, and you should be intimately involved in what they're learning. And if they're learning things they shouldn't, you should be putting the brakes on somehow, because you're responsible for their education. This is something Joseph knew. At 5 years old, they had to know the Scriptures. At 10 years old, they had to know the tradition. At 13 years old, they came under the law themselves, kind of like a bar mitzvah. And they were, at that point, they're called, bar means son of, mitzvah is law. They became son of the law at 13. And then Jesus then at 13 would have been himself a quote-unquote adult Jew now that has to obey the law on his own, not just under his father's wing. He's now responsible on his own to obey the law. And that's the way it should be with our confirmation. When our kids become confirmed, that really should be an event in their life where they realize that now I am an adult Christian and I have to live this even if I have to die for it.
Yeah. And that's how we know about Jesus' childhood. That's how we know about the relationship that he most probably had with Joseph as his father.
Right. And also they had to teach him a career. That there was a saying, the rabbis, during the time of Jesus, if a father does not teach his son a trade, he teaches him to be a thief because he doesn't have a way to earn a living. And so Joseph would have taught Jesus not only how to pray and how to memorize Scripture and how to live a righteous life, but he would also teach him how to chop rocks, how to shape them with a chisel, how to build. Isn't it interesting that Jesus said, I will build my church? What is he? He's a builder. Of course, he's a builder. And Paul talks about this tent that we live in. Why does Paul talk about tents all the time? Because he's a tent maker. This is what I mean by understanding. Paul's words come alive if you understand the culture that he lived in, the sports events that were going on, and the tents that were being made. And Paul talks about this tent of our body. Well, of course, he's going to talk about tents. That's what he knows. Jesus is going to talk about building. He talks about building a tower, or I build my church. And of course, because he's a builder.
Now, just to kind of deviate from Jesus and Joseph, strictly speaking, this whole attack about Mary having other children, Jesus having brothers, we know that a proper reading of the Scriptures would provide us a different answer.
I have friends that have the father and mother have the first floor. And then they build, when son number 1 gets married, they build a second story. And then son number 2, they live 4 stories up. Mom and dad are on the first floor, and the older brothers, the younger goes up, and they all have kids, and they all live together. They don't call them cousins, they're all brothers. My friend in Jordan, I said to him, his name's Elias. Everywhere we went, he said, that's my brother, that's my brother. I said, Elias, how many brothers do you have? He says, 15,000 were a tribe, a Catholic Bedouin tribe. They don't think of cousins over there. They think of brothers. And that's the way. And also another way, Americans think a brother has to be from the same mother, but this is not the way the culture was back then. Even when a woman didn't have milk to feed her baby, she couldn't go to CVS and buy formula in a bottle. She would have to find another woman that had enough milk that she could feed her baby and your baby. And any baby that drank from that breast was called a milk brother. So you can have brothers there that are not even related to you, but you had the same source of milk when you were growing up. That is always forever your milk brother. So there's also the idea that Joseph may have been married earlier. That's the whole Eastern Church believes that, before people say, oh, Steve's crazy. That was the belief of the early church and the whole Eastern Church even today, that Joseph was a man who already had a family. His wife died. And those brothers and sisters mentioned would have been stepbrothers and sisters, but they would have lived with them and been stepbrothers and sisters in the community. And that makes sense because it says that his brothers, which Protestants like to say that means his younger brothers, younger brothers would never make fun of an older brother because the older brother stands in the sandals of his father. He stands to inherit the father's estate and legislative authority. When the father dies, the oldest son becomes the firstborn, and that's an office that he takes. In John chapter 7, you see those brothers of Jesus mocking him. Why don't you go up to Jerusalem and show yourself? If you're so smart, why don't you go? The younger brothers would have never done that. Older stepbrothers certainly would have, or cousins would have. So there's a lot of reasons. It's a whole other topic that Mary did not have other sons and daughters. In fact, it says Mary, the mother of Jesus, not Mary, the mother of Jesus, Joseph, Simon, Judah, and all those. It's very clear.
Well, that is very clear, and there are a lot of other attacks. Like for example, was Jesus a Buddhist? Did he visit the Himalayas? We've talked about this very briefly, but the simple question is, where was Jesus during those silent years?
He was in Nazareth. It was very clear that he was in Nazareth. It never says anything about going anywhere. When people we know him and his father. They're the carpenters. So what did Jesus do that whole time? They were a carpenter. Everybody they didn't say he's the Buddhist. They said he's the carpenter. He's the guy that built all this stuff. He was very much there. He didn't go anywhere else.
Well, I've been talking with Steve Ray, coming to you from the Good News Cruise. It's been a real joy. Thank you so much, Steve, for your time.
You're welcome. We got about through half of it, I think.
We did, yes, just about half. Steve is taking another group to Israel, so by all means, AveMariaRadio.net, find out more about Steve's trips. And thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.